Hey, PreSales Collective, it's your host, James Kaikis, and today I'm going to be joined by Chase Schults, Director of Architect and Cloud Specialist at Salesforce.org. The topic of today's episode is winning the technical sale with architecture. In the PreSales Collective, we've had many discussions around what is pre-sales. We're all very familiar with the terms of sales engineers or solutions consultants, but what about those other roles that can be utilized as overlay roles, value engineering or solutions architecture? And so in today's episode, Chase is going to talk to us about the solutions architect role and how it is different than the sales engineer role, and how, if utilized appropriately, it can have a multiplier effect on your organization and on your business. Enjoy. Today's episode is sponsored by Consensus. Scale your pre-sales organization with interactive video demos. Experience an interactive demo at goconsensus.com. Chase, welcome to the PreSales Podcast. How's it going today?
Pretty good. How about you, James?
I'm great. I'm glad we are talking about architecture, Chase. This is going to be a fun topic. I feel like you and I have talked about this a couple of times behind the scenes, but now it's live on the podcast. How do you feel about that?
I'm going to be honest. I'm pretty excited about it. It's going to be an exciting situation. It's going to be a good 45 minutes.
I think it's going to be a great 45 minutes, Chase. Before we get there, though, I want to talk a little bit about Utah and the Utah tech scene. I've had a couple of conversations around this, including one with you, and Utah is getting a really great brand name for being a tech hub. What do you have to say about that?
I mean, Silicon Slopes, it's real. You got Silicon Valley in California, you have Silicon Slopes in Utah. There's a lot of reasons that really, if you ask me, in my opinion, of what contributes to what we lovingly call Silicon Slopes is, we've got a lot of very young, very hungry talent. And, not to speak ill of anything, but literally just came in from most of them came in from serving a mission where they were actually out selling religion. Like if we take it all aside and we actually call it what it is, not only are they helping spread the gospel, but they're connecting to people on an emotional level. So they're really coming in from like a field sales position and quite literally aligning themselves and going, I want to continue my transformation. And they're looking to organizations to help them do that. And Utah is ripe and hungry for technology with a huge entrepreneurial mindset. And then you tag team that with a huge young workforce that's young and hungry. And you get the perfect mix. And we call it Silicon Slopes.
Silicon Slopes sounds real good. And just to clarify, you mentioned the religion aspect because Utah has a lot of members of the Mormon religion. Is that correct?
I forgot to mention that. Yes. I just assume being from Utah, everybody already knows that, but you are 100% right.
It is quite interesting. And I love seeing the cities that are popping up outside of San Francisco that are becoming tech hubs. And I've heard a lot of people who say, hey, I've been thinking about moving to Utah, especially with the exodus that's happening in California. So that's so interesting when you talk about Silicon Slopes. I'm excited to talk more about Utah with PreSales Collective. The local community is starting to get together. So really looking forward to see what the future of tech in Utah looks like.
Agreed. It's exciting. We're on a growth explosion path is the way I'd look at it.
So let's talk about your pre-sales journey. So how did you stumble into this career?
That's a good question. So I actually started before I got into pre-sales. I actually started in marketing and I wanted to do nothing but guerrilla marketing campaigns. Like I was dedicated to it. And I wanted to do some of those crazy big guerrilla marketing, change the world, unsaid messages, so to speak. And I was approached by the VP of the department at the time of marketing. And they said, hey, you know what? We actually need you to learn a new technology thing that we're looking at doing. And it's called Salesforce. Have you heard of it before? Now, I was young and hungry. And I went, of course I have. And they went, really? Yes. And I promptly printed out literally everything I could find on Salesforce. And this was about 13 years ago. So this was like just after they started retiring S controls and they introduced workflow to the platform, which is huge, right? And I literally learned everything I could about Salesforce. And I actually got, my feet wet, so to speak, in the world of Western Governors University, which is the largest online university that's competency-based. They kind of said, hey, Salesforce, I'm going to throw you into the deep end of the pool. You're going to help us implement Salesforce for all of our university. And it went from like a 10-user license instance to about a 4,000 person license instance almost overnight, which was wild. And that's really where I got, the deep enterprise experience of really trying to figure out how to solution across the entire situation and not just focused on a specific solution for a specific department. From there, I went to a place called OC Tana, which does employee recognition and appreciation, makes you feel good about yourself and how long you've worked for an organization, and allows for you to feel really good about spending so many of your years at some organization, which is great. And then I got the job here at Salesforce.org. And Salesforce.org is a unique environment because of the fact that it's mission-driven first and then metrics, which to me is really why I wanted to join this organization. Is I get to focus on impact, positive impact, what makes the world go round, and helping nonprofit and education institutions really further their mission. But my favorite thing, I tell my boss this all the time, or I remind him all the time, is as I was going through the interview process, he was like, look, Chase, you've never been in sales on your resume. You've never been in sales. You don't look like you're ready to actually take a step into the pre-sales world and really do it. And he's like, can you change my mind? And I was like, look, I was a missionary for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I'm going to be honest with you, there is nothing harder than selling religion. And I can guarantee you that I can sell software. And he chuckled about it a little bit. And he was like, all right, well, then we'll give you a shot. That changed my mind. And that's what got me into pre-sales.
I love that you shared that, Chase. A lot of people don't understand that Salesforce.org is different than Salesforce.com. So how big is Salesforce.org?
So Salesforce.org actually is about a 1,400 person organization right now. And it actually is one of the operating units of Salesforce. But where that gets really cool is really how Salesforce can help further and impact the mission of nonprofits. And that's really what we focus on. We focus on driving impact and mission-driven values for our nonprofit education institutions and helping them change the world.
Chase, I'm excited to dive into today's topic, winning the technical sale with architecture. With PreSales Collective, we continue to bring up different functions and roles that exist in pre-sales. So many people think, oh, there's just a solutions consultant, solutions engineer, they do everything. There's value engineers, there's solutions architects, there's system engineers, and there's all of these roles that can exist together in bigger organizations or enterprise organizations, and even the smaller organizations. We're actually starting to see some companies that only have 15 employees that are starting to separate out their architecture teams and their value teams. And so it's starting to be a trend that's happening a little bit earlier. And so today's episode, we're going to dive into architecture and talk about the difference between solutions engineering and more specifically, the details of solutions architecture. Let's level set, Chase. Tell me a little bit more about the solutions architecture role and how it is different than a solutions engineer.
That's a great question. So, and that's one of the questions that I get quite a bit at Salesforce when somebody says, hey, Chase, well, why do we want to invest more into your team? And I'm always like, what's king is making sure that we have a lot of SEs. And I'm like, yeah. But let me tell you why we provide value to SEs, right? So solution engineers really focus on the solution in the application itself. Obviously I'm akin to Salesforce, or I'm very, very biased to Salesforce. But let's say, for example, you've got a solution engineer that focuses on Service Cloud, right? They know everything about all the aspects of Service Cloud, but that's where they live. Where a solution architect adds value to that solution engineer is to be able to say, hey, let's look outside of just that product set and understand the different values that could be brought to this customer from all across the organization. So they really focus on overall integration, security, strategy with the platform or the application, how to meet truthfully what the customer is looking for and not trying to fit a round peg into a square hole. And that's truthfully what it is, right? Is how do we tailor the solution with a solution architect to really deliver the most value for the customer and ensure that the customer is successful?
I really appreciate some of the specifics that you went into there. So let me ask you a question about perspectives that people might have who might say, well, that sounds like a solutions engineer, and that sounds like the solutions engineer's job. What do you have to say about that?
Generally speaking, a solution engineer can be extremely talented. I know a plethora of distinguished engineers that are extremely powerful and know a vast majority of technology, and they could probably talk on the same level as a solution architect. But where that solution architect still applies or adds value is truthfully in looking at it from the holistic picture. Solutions engineers are so skilled at being able to design and help craft a solution for a customer that they don't always take the moment to step back and go, how is this being orchestrated across the holistic picture? And that's where the solution architect really comes into play.
That's a perfect response because, like you said, solutions engineers for Salesforce, if you're part of core, you have to know most of the product set or all the products. And if you run a specialty, you know everything top down. But at the same time, you only know the world of Salesforce. And so I like that you talk about the architecture is much more beyond just the Salesforce platform and everything else in the ecosystem. That's a very important distinction. How do these roles typically work together, Chase?
I lovingly look at my architects, my team of architects, as what I'd call the black ops or the dark ops ninjas of solution engineering, primarily because the SE can take probably 85, 90% of the conversation. And they have a close partnership with the architect in their region or area or business unit that really focuses on specifically that broader spectrum of technology and knows that, hey, you know what? This customer is starting to ask questions around security. They're going to get out of my wheelhouse real quick. So I'm going to reach out to the architect, bring them in and ensure we're starting to head off those conversations before they even become an issue, making sure we're addressing that before that even comes up. Truthfully, as we look at the broader perspective of how these roles work together, my architects are very closely aligned with what we'd call like our customer success group, making sure that as we move to handoff on some of these more technical topics, ensuring that those technical topics are covered from start to finish so there isn't a drop or a loss in the gap, and making sure that the customer's successful from the beginning rather than coming back around and saying, hey, I forgot to do these things. So that's the way I kind of see this is the SE is really the customer facing. They're on the ground every day, helping design solutions for Salesforce. And then my team comes in and helps provide a bit more depth in the areas that are generally more technically intense, I guess is the way I'd put it. Security can be a very deep topic and it can drive and dive extremely fast. Same with infrastructure. If an SE gets asked, how does your infrastructure scale to match the number of customers that you have? That's where my architect's going to be like, hey, I ate this for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Let's do this. Where that SE is going to be like, that's a great question. Let me help you get connected.
Chase, I like that you brought this up because I'm having some recollections of my life as a solutions engineer in a startup. When I was at Showpad, I worked for a Belgium-based company and GDPR came out. And as an SE, I had to know so much about security. I love that we talk about the SA team doing the technically intense components because there's so much discussion happening in the pre-sales collective right now about should SEs be biz savvy or tech savvy? And if you have an additional layer of technical with the SA function that can handle security, it allows your SE team to be a little more biz savvy. And as Todd Jansen at Salesforce says, you don't need to make unicorns out of your SEs because we make these job descriptions that ask everyone to know everything under the sun, and it's actually impossible to do. Let's talk about a deal. So can you walk me through an example of a deal cycle and where the SE came into play and where the SA came into play?
So generally speaking, what a deal cycle looks like from my perspective, now I qualify it with my perspective for one reason. My perspective is, the leader of the architect and cloud specialist team. I always have to qualify that to make sure everybody understands I don't run an SE team that is the typical SE. And so I don't have complete understanding of that first 2 or 3 stages of the sales cycle. But the way it looks from me, the opportunity gets created and it gets qualified by the account executive. That account executive has a series of questions that they're expected to ask the customer to make sure that the opportunity is actually real. And then they reach out to their SE and engage the SE to actually have a better conversation around discovery and requirements gathering. Now that SE will go through that requirements gathering session to better understand what the customer is trying to achieve or the values or mission that they're trying to work after. And they may identify areas that would require more technically intense situations. Like let's say, for example, the GDPR thing is a huge thing. Let's say, for example, a customer says, hey, I've actually got customers that are based out of EMEA or Europe, and we need to ensure that we're making sure that we're thinking about GDPR and showing that at the same time. At the same time, we go through this digital transformation. That SE is going to listen for those keywords. They're going to hear GDPR. They're going to hear about security. They're going to think about compliance. They're going to go, oh, this is a perfect opportunity for a solution architect to come in and really provide a lot of value. Now, that's where they create, in our world, we call them deal support requests or requesting the support from an architect. They create that deal support request. They say, yo, here are the topics that I think are going to need to be covered. But obviously, we're not going to stop there. So if you hear of any additional topics, architect, during that call, by all means, let's make sure that we're getting them tackled ahead of time. They may reach out to another architect to ensure that they have the depth. Because to your point, the way we can provide scale as that second layer is to ensure that we take on those technically intense topics, boil them down to valuable pieces of information, and get those pieces of information back out to the SE as like an elevator pitch of saying, hey, when somebody comes up with you with these questions, here's the high level conversation, and then engage our team to actually have the deeper level conversation. And ensuring that we can do and provide some scale in there is a very important thing because, again, SEs are very busy people. And the last thing we want to do is bog them down with trying to understand every aspect of technology because it just never will work, to your point.
I love that you just talked about the elevator pitch for the pre-sales teams to be able to hear a couple of key components. You talked about the SEs being busy. Some organizations have 1-to-1 ratios. I've heard of organizations up to 1-to-7, 1-to-10, 1-to-15. Do you look at the SA role and function in terms of ratios like we look at SEs to AEs?
We do, but not in the same capacity. So like there's a sweet spot, what I'd call the sweet spot of a solution architect to this number of SEs. But it entirely depends. Truthfully, when I look at it, I base it on more of how much ACV is being covered by that architect. Because I know where the hot spots are when it comes to the amount of ACV or amount of value that's being driven out of those accounts. And being able to say, hey, I know for a fact, let's say, for example, there's a huge number of nonprofit organizations that are based out of New York and Washington, D.C. So obviously, I'm going to stack my East Coast primarily for that one reason, because I know that I've got a lot of big nonprofits, a lot of very, very large organizations based out of the East Coast, and I'm going to need support in time zone and region. And that's where our SEs are stacked as well. So I follow kind of the same pattern. I don't have a magic number of saying, yes, it's one architect to 15 SEs. It depends, just primarily based upon the topics that may be wanting to be covered by the customer.
We're sitting here talking about solutions architects, but for you have multiple types of architects. Is that correct?
I do. I have several types of architects.
Can you tell us what those roles are and like their specific function or support within the organization?
My team is very unique. It's comprised of what I call platform architects, or what they would be called as technical architects. So that's an interchangeable term to me. Those architects really focus on the value and interoperability of Salesforce. Salesforce as a platform, which is why they're called platform architects, right? So they focus on how Salesforce works and ticks and operates on the back end. What does the data store look like? How is the search engine different than the actual database layer? And how does the application separate from the actual database? And how does metadata work? And how does security factor there? All of that is really where they live. That's their sweet spot. They talk about compliance, security, identity, infrastructure. That's really what they do. I also have enterprise architects. Now, my enterprise architects, they are a different breed. And the reason they are a different breed is because they look at technology holistically. My enterprise architects are hyper-focused on nonprofit and higher ed institutions. And I look specifically for that background because they will have already interacted and integrated and worked with other systems in the higher ed or nonprofit space. That's where Salesforce comes in and says, actually, we can help you with that integration story. How do we make that easier? What does that look like? How do we ensure we're getting the information to the point that it needs to get to? And how do we bring data back? And how do we visualize that data for your users to be able to take more advantage of it? So that's the biggest difference between platform or technical architects and my enterprise architects. Platform focus specifically on platform. Enterprise architects focus on, hey, I know how a student information system works. I know how it interacts and integrates, and I can help you actually connect those together.
You made a comment about background. So I'm interested in like the hiring profile component of it. Do you have a certain profile that you typically like to hire for the platform architect role versus the enterprise architect role?
I do. So our platform architects, I focus on a pre-sales solution. They should be coming from a pre-sales environment. Obviously for Salesforce, I want them to have a Salesforce perspective. I don't generally focus too much on their industry expertise at that point because of the fact that I want them to provide depth and scale to the platform understanding. Now, my enterprise architects are different, and that's primarily because they're going to be talking about enterprise technology. And when we talk about enterprise technology, when we look at nonprofits or higher eds, they have tailored systems that are purpose-built for solutions that they're trying to achieve. And I look for them to have a consulting background as well. I want them to show that they've been able to put these things together so that when they walk into a room with a customer, they can speak with authority and knowledge going, yes, I've done this and I know how to connect this. And let's walk through how that'll work for you.
Chase, I'm just sitting here thinking about how many of our companies are asking our SEs to do all of these types of things. They're asking our SEs to know the ecosystem, to know the integration strategy. And it just puts a lot of strain and stress on the SE and also on the organization. So I'm really glad that you're walking us through this. Talk a little bit about like a promo path for somebody. Is it like a technical architect to an enterprise? Are those two separate functions and promotion upward? Talk to me about that.
So when it comes to the promotion path for our architects, there's really, I like to say, I know this sounds facetious, but it's like the world is their oyster, so to speak. It entirely depends on where they want to head. Now, obviously, we could take the platform or technical architect. They will go through the standard steps of saying they're technical architect, senior lead, principal, on to distinguished, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, they may say, I want to take a more technical path. And if that be the case, then we say, all right, let's align you to the actual enterprise version or the enterprise architect route. But there's a lot of steps that are required in order to get there, right? Like you need to do pro bono projects. You need to work on helping individuals implement Salesforce so that you have that enterprise experience and not just platform specific. That's where it forks. And we say, yep, all right, you want to take the more technology enterprise focus, then great, we can move you down that route. But it is going to take a learning path and then a learning curve to get you there. Or you can continue down the platform architect and go senior lead, principal, and to distinguished. It depends on what they want to do and really where their desire lies.
Chase, I'm an SC at my heart. So I'm curious. I want to ask all these questions. I really appreciate the perspective that you're offering and giving our listeners something to think about, especially for those who don't have an SA function. And then for those that are considering it or have one and understanding how that you can have different levels and layers of the SA role. I want to talk about this concept of winning the technical sale with architecture. So we've talked about the role. We talked about how it fits in an org. We've talked about different types of architects, but let's talk about what this actually means. What does winning the technical sale with architecture actually mean?
How do we win the technical sale with architecture? It's quite literally one of the most exciting topics that I've been able to try to help figure out or make it, chip away at, is trying to identify a way to help our customers understand truthfully how technology can align to what they're trying to do and help them achieve their mission faster and actually allow for them to focus on what they do best. And that is their mission. And that mission can be anything. It's interchangeable for commercial versus nonprofit. It doesn't matter. But we actually run a program at salesforce.org that we lovingly call Spotlight. And what that program actually does is it helps our customers understand. We sit down, we go through huge requirements gathering sessions. We understand their enterprise landscape of software as it sits today. And we go, what's working and what's not working? It's amazing to see the number of people in IT that are like, oh no, it all works perfectly. It's seamless. Nothing's ever a problem, right? And I'm sure all of our SEs have heard that several times. And then you talk to the business and the business is like, it's literally a dumpster fire. It doesn't work. And you sit there and you go, wow, we need to bring them together. That's what Spotlight's all about. It brings the business and the architecture, the IT teams together and says, hey, let's hash this out. Let's figure out what's going on here. And then what we do is we actually align where their gaps are or their pain points are, and we align it to technology that either Salesforce has, and we've actually even recommended technology outside of Salesforce, primarily because we want to make sure that they're successful. Now, Salesforce as a platform can do a huge array of things, as we know. But one of the things, that we do is we say, hey, what? We are your partner to ensure that you're actually achieving your mission. And what we want to do is align the right technologies, regardless of who owns that technology or what that technology is. So we'll take a step back and we'll say, all right, we hear where your pain points are. We see where the problems exist. Let's identify and line up to what that looks like from a Salesforce perspective. What technologies would we plug in there? And then we'll actually show you some of how that technology plugs in. And then we take it even a step further and we go, actually, we're going to give you a roadmap. We're going to help you understand. So, earlier I talked about how we make sure the handoff program is successful and saying that, hey, once they go from pre-sales to sales, how do we make sure that nothing falls through the cracks? That's exactly what this program is also designed to do, is to be able to say, hey, we're going to help you understand a roadmap for your 30, 60, 90 days. How do we get you value through the door as fast as possible so you can start seeing that ROI? Maybe it's something as simple as saying, let's figure out how single sign-on is going to work for your organization. Let's get single sign-on and Salesforce federated with Active Directory so that when they log in, they can log into Salesforce at the same time and never have a problem. It's that low-hanging fruit that a lot of times our customers have a hard time actually engaging on and executing on those first few days. Additionally, we want to bring in their partner or the CSG organization and say, hey, this is what we've heard. This is what we're proposing and how we're aligning our technology or technology out of Salesforce to help them fill those gaps. Do you agree with it? It's an open-ended question. We want engagement from them and we want their buy-in. Because if we get their buy-in, we all know we're on a unified front to ensure that we're delivering that technology. In a short, we essentially say, all right, we're all a unified front. We can now roll into the customer and say, yep, everybody agrees that this is the right path forward for you. And what's beautiful about that is the people that are actually going to be delivering it, they agree too. And they're going to help you deliver it faster. How great is that? And it literally demolishes technical barriers. I mean, the feedback has been that you helped us demolish the barrier between IT and business and helped us to understand the technology we needed to bring in to revolutionize the way we interact with our people. If that's not great feedback, I don't know what is. But it helped us say, yep, here you go. Let's align with the technical sell and sell it.
Demolish barriers between IT and the business. Like, there it is. There's some stars on my notes here. Chase, I have so many questions. I don't think we have enough time in the day for me to dig on that. That is fantastic. And I really appreciate you breaking that down for us. Let's start a little bit tactically. Why would somebody bring in your team to do this spotlight function? What requirements exist of the customer for you to actually get involved?
So there's a number of things that we look at. A, are they ready to change? Or are they asking for change? A lot of times the business will be asking for change, and we need to find that champion in IT that says, yes, something needs to change as well. We recognize that there's a gap here. That's one of the big ones. The next one is we need executive alignment. And that's where I think a lot of times we see the technical sell kind of fall over to some degree, because you can find a champion at the lowest level and they're like, yes, I love Salesforce, I love Apex, I love Heroku, let's go fight, win. But they don't have the firepower to get it across the line. We need to align with the senior level executives in IT to ensure that they hear exactly what's happening and how Salesforce is going to help fill that gap to help them overcome and go, yep, technically we need to do this. We need to make this world better. That's kind of what we do. Now, I will say that the architect team, well, I love to believe that we boil the ocean ourselves. We certainly do not. And there are a huge village of people that stand behind us to really support that. And one of the biggest ones is business value selling. How do we ensure alignment with our business value selling team to ensure that we're aligning the technology to what they need to achieve? Because they've gone through some requirements gathering sessions as well, and they understand what the value is for the business. So we partner very, very, very closely with the BVS team to ensure that we understand what their business value is. And then technically, how do we align with that? So that's why I say, we demolish those technical barriers to say, yep, we've aligned to what you're trying to achieve. Let's achieve it.
And just to clarify, the business value team is really focused on some of the hard metrics and the numbers on ROI, correct?
Yep. Like, how fast can they gain adoption? How fast does it make their mission operate? How much shorter does it take an application process? That's where the business value team is engaged.
So what is the SE's role in this spotlight?
The SE has probably one of the most important roles. Full stop. I'm not trying to say that to toot anybody's horn, but I'm going to be real with you. The SE has the most important role during a spotlight. And that is because they play quarterback. Generally speaking, the AE goes, hey, you know what? This is outside of my realm of understanding. I'm going to let the SEs and the architects handle it from here. And they kind of back away. And that's where the SE becomes our linchpin. They're the ones that are really helping us to align with the business. They've got the relationship. They have the account knowledge. They have the relationship that they've built with the account over N number of months and are able to actually align us better than anybody else. Additionally, they're the ones that are going to continue pushing that forward after our team disappears, so to speak. So our team is going to deliver that value and that technical alignment. And that SE is going to continue going, hey, look, remember, this is how it aligns. This is how it's going to help you achieve your mission. And then helps us build demos and deliver demos based off of that as well. That's where an SE is so powerful, is they take everything that we like. I hate to say it, we're the underlying tech, and the SE makes that underlying tech look beautiful. And that's where they still excel. That's still where they go, yep, here's the value that I provide to this entire cycle.
Chase, I love the enthusiasm because I just want to sit here and ask questions all day long about this. This is so interesting and it's great to see in action. I always like to try to get very tactical and actionable on this podcast. And so you talked about demolishing the bridge between the IT and business. And I think this is something that I don't care how long you've been a pre-sales professional, we all struggle with to one extent or the other. So do you have any suggestions on how the SE team and the SA team can work together to break those internal barriers down?
That's a tricky question, primarily for a lot of reasons, right? Like generally speaking, and this, kind of goes back to that. What does the engagement path look like for an architect? So generally speaking, in my world, my architects are moments in time is the way I put it. They come in, they fill a role, they fill a gap, and they align the technology best. But then they disappear, and that SE continues that conversation and continues pulling it forward. But how we align ourselves internally to ensure that we look as their trusted advisor, regardless if you're an SE or an SA or whatever it may be, as long as that relationship has been built, you have the ability to help bridge that gap and say, hey, look, this is where you're driving. This is the technology that you need to deliver. How do we make sure that it comes together and actually delivers the right way? Spotlight is an outstanding foray into that space, but I don't think it's the net all answer, right? I don't have all the answers, but I think it starts to tackle that to some degree and put them in the same room, because the biggest barrier that I've seen is the lack of communication between departments. IT doesn't even realize that these people work there. And these people don't even realize that those are all the people that make it work. And so that's where we see all of our success right now at Spotlight. It's just getting them in the room. And a lot of times they're like, you still work here? And you're like, yeah, isn't that great?
Getting people communicating. Who knew that would be the key? No, I like that a lot. We've had a couple of episodes. Ryan Deemer talked about some of his challenges when he went from inside sales to field sales, and it's getting in that room and sometimes running into that political landscape and that IT buyer landscape. We've done things on Stump the Chump on this podcast, where you run into political battles at times as well. I have one very specific question for you, Chase. You mentioned it a couple of times. I need to dig you on it. What is the SA's role in the post-sale aspect of architecture?
As much as I like to say that the SA ends, their engagement ends at point of sale, it's not the reality. And that's primarily for a number of reasons. And it's generally because a lot of times our SAs or our architects will be in there discussing very deep technical topics that don't necessarily relate to people outside of either the IT team or the delivery team, because they're looking for very specific things. So a lot of times what will happen is once the sale is closed, we'll be engaged to either help the partner understand what we discussed with the customer or actually go through a joint, like, hey, let's be your sounding board. Hey, did we actually achieve with what we were looking to achieve or align with what the customer told us? Because a lot of times the customer is going to say one thing to us and they're going to tell their partner another thing. And it's like, how does that match? We have to have a very close relationship with all of those partners, with all of those CSG folks to ensure that what's being said up front and what we're being told aligns with what they're being told and how they can deliver the product.
Thanks for that, Chase, because I think it's very important, because a lot of times pre-sales teams get bad reputations for being involved. Contract signature happens. Information doesn't get passed to the post-sale. Customers feel like they have to go through a whole new sales process. And then what people don't realize is the adoption and utilization and potential upsell and expansion of that account is at risk because of poor execution on the handoff. So, Chase, this has been an incredible podcast. What kind of advice do you have for people out there, organizations out there that are exploring the idea of creating an architecture function?
I mean, my biggest piece of advice is don't hold back. You should do it. But there's a lot of, little nuggets of advice that I'd give that echo that. First of all, I think one of the biggest barriers that you have to tackle when creating the SA role or the architecture role as an overlay is that it's an overlay. And being able to help align value to that overlay role is one of the most tricky pieces. So, the nugget of insight that I would give or advice that I'd give is really focused around how are you baking in value situations or value identifiers to that overlay role to ensure that when the question is, what value do they add to our organization? You can draw a hard line to it and say, not only do they influence money that's coming in through the door, they have an uplift capability. We saw that the opportunity was this, the architect was engaged, and it's now this. We covered all of these deep topics. We covered architecture, compliance, and identity. Those three topics alone, they're baked into the product. So I can't draw a hard line to ACV and say, like, look, we brought in money, because it's all baked in. So we can go, these are value props that we've generally seen sales cycles die on, because if we can't align with what they're looking for, it goes away. And identifying how many conversations they have versus how much ACV is coming through the door, that's truthfully where some of that value prop of saying, how do I build out a program for architecture as an overlay really comes to play there. So I would say, one of the biggest things is making sure you have those value prop identified to help overcome a lot of those concerns around why is it so important. The other area is drawing that hard line in the sand and being like, hey, These are topics that we want to have deep specialization on, whether that be infrastructure or security or compliance. Those generally are what I'd lovingly call a rabbit hole, right? You could dig on those for hours at a time and never hit the bottom. You just don't want an SE sitting in a room having to learn that exact same stuff when you could just have a specific resource come in and have that conversation for 9 hours. And that SE's like, well, I'm done. I'm out, right? Focus on the value for the customer SE and let that architect manage the security piece. That's the other piece.
Well said, Chase. Really appreciate your time. Thanks for being on the podcast today. Tremendously impactful and insightful. So for those who want to maybe talk more about architecture, Chase, can they ping you in the PreSales Collective Slack? And more importantly, in the channel that we created called Role Solutions Architect. Are you okay with that?
Never hesitate. I'm available.
Let's continue the conversation there. All right, Chase, thanks for the time. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, James. Have a great day.
All right, PreSales Collective, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Chase brought the energy today. I loved hearing his perspective. I'm curious and have so many questions. What was great was that Chase broke down the solutions engineering role and the SA role very distinctly. He said that the SEs focus on the application or the product that we're selling for our companies and the value there. But the solutions architect has to know all of the other product sets that may be in the ecosystem and the infrastructure. I can tell you from my own personal experiences, I have potentially nightmares of having to have conversations in the weed infrastructure, in the weed network with very senior people, because that is what was asked of our SE org. And that was what I asked of my teams. But at the same time, having this overlay role that will allow the SE to focus on value and have the SA come in on the technically intense components is great. I mentioned this in the episode. Todd Jansen says it best: stop making unicorns out of our SEs. Being able to have augmented teams, overlay teams that allow our SEs to not necessarily have such an expansive role will result in them having a little bit more clear-cut role expectations and definitions. I love that Chase talked about providing an elevator pitch to his SEs. When the SE hears different components in the sales cycle, he or she knows that they're going to need the solutions architecture involved, and providing an elevator pitch to allow them to answer that question in real time, but then go and get help later is really, really interesting and powerful. One of the things that Chase dove into was this program that he calls Spotlight, and bringing the IT and business functions together and having the SE and the SA and the extended teams help in that deal cycle. That type of engagement is not something that SEs typically have time for. And so having an SA be able to run that function, run that engagement to go deeper with the organization, talk about not just your company's products, but the ecosystem, and be a trusted partner, not just through the sale, but passing that information on to the post-sale is extremely valuable. Again, a good call to action is join our PreSales Collective Slack and search for the channel Role Solutions Architecture and reach out to Chase for more information. If you are a fan of solutions architecture or you have some thoughts on it, I'm going to encourage you to reach out to me, because we are looking for more blog content, more webinar content, more podcast content on solutions architecture, value engineering, and these other overlay roles that are part of our pre-sales organizations. All right, PreSales Collective, as always, I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. Like and share our podcast. Otherwise, I will see you next week.